In 1915, Rosa Luxemburg warned that humanity faced a choice: either a transition to socialism or a Russian into barbarism. Over a century later, her warnings remain relevant as working class people across the world are forced to endure the effects of greed, austerity, and imperialist war. The ruling classes insist that there's no alternative. They preach that we have to accept poverty, environmental destruction, social inequality as inevitable, and that the system can't be changed. Looking to Cuba, a small, historically underdeveloped Caribbean island scarred by colonialism, we see a nation that's defied the odds, resisting domination and building a socialist alternative in an imperialist world. The Cuban Revolution, forged by the people's will, proves that there is an alternative that puts the needs of humanity and the planet before profit, and that's socialism. The Cuban Revolution triumphed in 1959. It faced a country scarred by poverty, before the Cuban Revolution, It faced a country scarred by poverty and exploitation. In the 50s, under the US-backed dictatorship of Batista, Cuba was a country deeply divided by race, class, and exploitation. 600,000 Cubans were without work, only 11% of Cubans drank milk, 4% ate meat, and 90% of rural children had parasites. 43% of the population were illiterate. Yet Havana was a glittering playground of celebrities and mafias. After nearly 6 years of guerrilla struggle led by Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement, which was supported by the workers, the peasants, the students, the revolutionary forces entered Havana, toppling Batista's regime and taking on the immense task of rebuilding a nation for the people. But how did they do it? What did this actually look like in practice? It looked like providing free and universal healthcare for all Cubans, a right that had been denied to so many for years. It looked like creating mass organizations to ensure that everyone at every level of Cuban society could actively participate in the transformation to socialism. It looked like fighting all forms of discrimination from the ground up. But then how did these ideas take material form? The answer lays in the creation of a socialist state built on a central economic planning, a complete reorganization of production and distribution to serve the Cuban people rather than the interests of private profit. The revolutionary government nationalized major industries, the banks and utilities, bringing them under public ownership. Foreign-owned companies and US corporations that had denied Cuba's economy were expropriated. Casinos and luxury hotels that once served the wealthy were converted into schools, hospitals, and housing. The first agrarian reform law broke up large estates, redistributing the land to farmers and establishing cooperatives to boost food production. Under socialist state economic planning, Cuba began to build an independent economy based on collective ownership, equality, and social need, putting the dignity of the Cuban people before profit. But Cuban socialism has never been static. It has evolved in response to changing conditions at home and abroad. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba faced a special period. When the imports had vanished, oil disappeared, and GDP plummeted. Socialist Cuba opened up to limited market mechanisms in response to the economic hardships, to relieve the population from the worst impacts of the economic crisis while maintaining the socialist character of the Cuban economy. These policies weren't imposed from above, but forged through mass discussion in neighborhoods, workplaces, and assemblies across the island. Every measure was debated, questioned, and refined by the people themselves. And of course, the reforms brought contradictions, because it created tensions between the market measures and the socialist ideals, but the government confronted them openly, using social policies to prevent new inequalities from taking root. And the result, not a single school, hospital, or home for the elderly was closed during the special period. And we look to a country like Britain. How would capitalist nations responded to this type of economic crisis? With austerity, layoffs, and despair. Cuba instead turned to its people, encouraging debate, popular participation, and people-led changes. And it forces us to ask, what type of movement do we want to build here? One that bends to capital, or one that stands with the people? We have to build a movement that organizes society around human need. And the Cuban example shows us that when the economy is planned collectively, when resources are directed by the people for the people, society can meet everyone's basic needs. But it's not just about resources, it's about power. By allowing the population to actively participate in decision making, Cuba ensures that the economy serves the people, not the other way around. But how was Cuba able to directly engage with the population? Through a system of participatory democracy, which encourages continuous involvement of the people in decision-making processes. Unlike in capitalist countries, where so-called democratic exercises are often reduced to ticking a box once every 4 or 5 years, Cuba's participatory model engages the entire population in regular meetings through neighborhood assemblies, often organized by the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the CDRs, the trade unions. They hold public consultations, and this allows for direct input on laws, policies, and national priorities. The very nature of participatory democracy means that governance is not confined to an election cycle, it remains a living process. In 2019, the Cuban people celebrated the approval of their new socialist constitution, which followed an extensive participatory process involving months of debate and redrafting across all sections of Cuban society. From August to November 2018, over 133,600 meetings were held in community centres, workplaces and schools, engaging more than 8.9 million Cubans in discussions about the first draft. And this popular process led to 760 amendments, reflecting nearly 60% of the original text being modified. In February 2019, 90% of the electorate participated in the national referendum, with 87% voting in favour of the new constitution, underscoring the population's deep engagement and commitment to defending and shaping Cuba's socialist project. In 2022, once again, Cuba showed how it actively involves the population when shaping national policy during the Family Code referendum, which redefined the concept of family to guarantee marriage equality, adoption rights for same-sex couples, and strong protections against gender-based violence. The code went through 25 drafts, 80,000 community meetings, and incorporated 300,000 public suggestions before being approved by over 2/3 of voters. In Britain, we need a movement that will fight for real democracy, not just box ticking, but a living, breathing people's power, where the decisions are shaped by communities, workplaces, and schools, not by the ruling elite. Cuba shows us how this can be done. Its socialist principles have built a nation rooted in solidarity, not exploitation, where the policy serves the people, and this vision extends beyond its shores. Cuba recognizes that it's, quote, the duty of each nation to make common cause with the oppressed, colonized, and exploited peoples, regardless of their location around the world, as cited in the 1960 First Declaration of Havana. This stance embodies the Cuban self-awareness in understanding its revolution as an element or essential part of the wider struggle against imperialism. In 1960, after the revolution took power, Cuba sent a team of medics to Chile after a devastating earthquake hit the country. Since then, over 400,000 Cuban medical professionals have worked in over 160 countries. Its heavily international medical brigade has helped 3.5 million people in 21 countries affected by national disaster and epidemic. Cuba also provides unwavering solidarity to anti-imperialist struggles across the world. For example, the Bolivarian Revolution in the face of recent events and escalating US military threats and economic warfare, as we've spoken about today, Cuba has continuously defended Venezuelan sovereignty and peace. from President Diaz-Canel in Cuba, heading a rally in solidarity with the Bolivarian people in Havana just last Thursday, to grassroots Cuban organizations hosting meetings and educational programs and solidarity events to support in support of Venezuela. It shows that this support and solidarity with the Venezuelan people is expressed at various levels of Cuban society. Similarly, since its inception, Socialist Cuba has long supported Palestine. From Che Guevara's 1959 visit to Gaza to the present-day cultural, political, educational initiatives focusing on the question of Palestine and solidarity with anti-imperialist movements. Just last week, tens of thousands of people marched in Havana to mark 2 years of the genocide, again headed by Diaz-Canel and Palestinian students mainly studying at Elam. This was a powerful reaffirmation of Cuba's steadfast support for the Palestinian people's right to freedom, dignity, and self-determination. After the march, Diaz-Canel hosted an exchange between Palestinian students, the Union of Young Communists, and other mass organizations of the Communist Party. A reminder that Cuba's solidarity with the Palestinian people is not symbolic, but it's active. Cubans see the struggle of the Palestinians as their struggle, the struggle against imperialism. And Cuba shows us that it is possible to solve the problems created by capitalism in its drive for profits, that it is possible to provide everyone in the world with the essentials for a dignified life, even with limited material resources. It shows us that socialism is a viable system worth fighting for. We need the example of Socialist Cuba now more than ever, as the working class is driven even deeper into crisis, while our government cuts public services, funds wars abroad, and represses anyone who dares to challenge its authority. But Cuba also needs us. The revolution is under attack, fighting for survival against the longest, most comprehensive economic blockade in history. The US blockade is carefully calculated economic war, designed in the words of Lester D. Mallory, former US Assistant Secretary of State, to weaken economic life in Cuba, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. Measures include prohibiting US companies or their subsidiaries from trading with Cuba, banning the sale of goods made with US components, and restricting ships that dock in Cuban ports from entering a US port for 6 months. Under Trump's first administration, US aggression towards Cuba was heightened with its maximum pressure policy, which imposed additional punitive sanctions, which included an additional 243 sanctions on Cuba, including 56 specifically targeting the energy sector, which is worse than the country's energy crisis, limiting access to vital parts and fuel needed to maintain and modernize the electrical grid. He also redesignated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, a baseless lie which falsely labels Cuba as high risk, cutting off access to international finance, aid, and essential imports. In a speech in December, President Miguel Diaz-Canel spoke of ships being docked for up to 15 days as they can't process the international banking systems because they are seen as a state sponsor of terror. This delay in oil and gas shipments causes regular blackouts they're not inevitable, but they're imposed by daily pressure by the imperialists. But why is Cuba a threat? Not for weapons or wealth. For its example, Cuba shows us what is possible under socialism. It shows that a system based on state planning, popular participation, and solidarity does work. It is possible to achieve what capitalist nations refuse: free healthcare, universal education, and a society guided by human dignity and not exploitation. The revolution remains active. The Cuban people continue to defend their sovereignty through creative resistance, finding collective ways to build, produce, and survive under the intensified blockade. In the energy sector, despite US attempts at destruction, Cuba has turned crisis into opportunity by expanding renewables. Under the climate plan Torre Vida life task, 92 solar parks are due to be installed, adding 1,200 megawatts to the grid, and reducing reliance on imported oil. In August this year, it was announced that 72 parks had already been installed. And it's really important to mention that the UJC are playing an active role in installing these solar parks, these photovoltaic parks, and promoting these projects, showing that the Cuban youth are part of shaping Cuba's sustainable socialist future. And the UJC have been fighting the blockade ideologically through programs like Tumba el Bloqueo, Smash the Blockade, educating the youth on US measures, and countering imperialist narratives, empowering them to defend the revolution and lead Cuba's socialist future. So to close, Cuba isn't a distant story, but it's a living guide for our own struggle. As Mariela Castro reminded us in our recent interview in Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, it's on page 10, she said, Cuba is a living revolutionary society. We're dynamic and in motion, not static as some claim. Cuba shows us that socialism isn't an abstract dream, but a practical force that can transform society, protect people, and challenge imperialist aggression. Through a planned economy, mass participation, and revolutionary discipline, Cuba has achieved what capitalism declares as impossible. In Britain, we must take inspiration from that living example to build an anti-racist, anti-imperialist, socialist movement rooted in the working class. We must reject opportunism and reactionary compromise and instead fight for socialism, connected to the struggles of the oppressed across the world, from Havana to Gaza, from Beirut to Burkina Faso, Congo to Caracas, San Juan to Sudan.
Bang, bang.
As Fidel said in 2002, something has to be done to save humanity. A better world is possible.